On Thursday, the hugely popular British Member of Parliament, Jo Cox, was killed in broad daylight in a horrific act of violence that some are linking to the vitriol surrounding next week's EU referendum in the UK. It's been a heated and deeply divisive campaign. On today's UpFront, in an interview recorded before the MP's tragic death, I asked Angel Gurria, Secretary General of the OECD, what he thinks the political and economic fallout from the vote will be, both for the UK and for the global economy. Will it be smooth sailing for Britain outside of the EU, or is it Brexit and bust? Angel Gurria, thank you for joining me on UpFront. The UK is about to vote on Brexit, on whether to quit the European Union and the EU's single market, the biggest single market in the world. You, the OECD, have talked about a Brexit tax, which the UK would have to pay in the form of, I think, 3% lower GDP, you said. The UK's Finance Minister, Chancellor George Osborne, has warned Brexit would force him to deliver an emergency budget to raise £30 billion in tax rises and spending cuts. Do those figures look about right to you? And are you worried that such a new round of austerity could trigger a recession in the UK?
Frankly, it's bad from every single angle. You know, the London School of Economics, the Confederation of British Industry, the Treasury, the OECD, everybody's looking at it from different angles. And the one common thread is it's negative, it's negative, it's negative, it's negative. We said it's like a tax, but it's starting to count now. Already Brexit is happening in the sense that it's costing, the uncertainty is costing low growth.
Capital flight.
Capital flight and low growth in the last quarter, etc. And then there's another question. Is why would you give up, let's say, about a month's equivalent of revenue in a household, average household in the UK, £2,000 to £5,000 per year, depending on whether it's now or 2030, for nothing in return. You know, nothing. When they say pay a tax, that's in order to get something, pavement or to get security or whatever. Here you get nothing in return. Why should you pay a tax to get nothing in return?
And just to be clear on my question, do you worry that there's a risk of the UK going into recession, as some economists have warned, post-Brexit?
There will be a number of very negative consequences. I'm not sure if it would go into a recession, but the problem is we're sure that it would leave a few percentage points of growth per year, but also over the years. There's absolutely no logic in the whole approach. Some politicians maybe are trying to profit, advance their careers at the expense of, but it's at the expense of the next generation. It's not even about the referendum. It's the next generation.
They would argue, of course, that they're going to still be able to trade and that they will get money back from all the budget contributions they'll save on, etc., etc.
It's 0.3% of the GDP. It's nothing. They're going to lose a lot more than they're going to save by saving those
and the continent-wide effects, because this is not just about Britain. Do you worry that Britain pulling out of the EU will lead to an unravelling of the European Union as a whole, with all the knock-on effects on continental growth, global growth?
It is mostly going to be about the UK. The unraveling may be because Scotland wants to stay in the EU, whereas the rest of the. So it's mostly about the UK. Now there's going to be a knock-on effect in Europe, and in the world, because the last thing we need is an injection of uncertainty at this stage, where we're dealing with so many other sources of uncertainty. But the question is mostly about the UK. So it's about, don't shoot yourself in the foot.
Okay.
There's absolutely no reason.
Just moving on from the specific pros and cons of the Brexit debate, why do you think it is that UK voters, 2/3 of those who support leaving the EU and 1 in 4 of those who support staying in, tell pollsters they don't trust the experts anymore when it comes to the economy? They don't trust the OECD or the IMF or the Bank of England. How has an organisation like the OECD, like so many other major organisations, become distrusted as an elite institution, its expertise, research ignored?
Because of the leaders of the leave movement are not appealing to facts or figures. They're appealing to emotions, and they're misleading public opinion. One of the things that is often repeated is we're stifled by the regulations. Well, actually, Britain was one of the least regulated and best regulated of the economies of the OECD. We measure that, we compare that. So that means you can be perfectly well an EU citizen, you can be a part of the EU and have your own regulation, choose your own regulation. It also suggests that there's very little marginal advantage that the UK can win in terms of regulatory flexibility.
You're in the United States right now promoting a new report that the OECD has done on the state of the US economy. You say in the report, 7 years after the financial crisis, the US economy has rebounded. There's been a comeback, you say, in terms of growth, employment, corporate profits, and yet you have voters in the United States who say they're not feeling any of those benefits and they're therefore angry at the political, economic, financial establishments. You recognize that?
Not only do I recognize that, we have measured the fact that inequality is now greater. And in fact, let's say, how do you measure inequality? Well, how about measuring the income of the lower 10% in terms of the income of the highest 10%? Okay, so it's about 10 times on average in the OECD. In the United States, it's almost double. So you're talking about a much higher inequality, and the inequality is found not only in terms of countries to country, it's found in region to region. Sometimes it's found even within the same city.
Any discussion these days about the state of the global economy, the US economy, the European economy, does tend to involve a reference to rising inequality, specifically income inequality. The OECD says, as a whole, OECD countries have income inequality that are at their highest levels for the past half century. You've said income inequality is now at a tipping point. We're at a tipping point on this subject. What would you say to your critics who say it's precisely the neoliberal free market policies advocated by the OECD in the past and now, deregulation, privatization, austerity, balanced budgets, it's those policies which have produced the record gap today between the richest 10% and the poorest 10%?
Unfortunately, even before the crisis, inequality was growing, but then the speed accelerated very dramatically. And we now have a situation where we have to address inequality as a specific target issue. It's not going to be taken care of by itself simply because we're going to have more growth. And then, of course, inequality will take care of itself. We need to target taxing policies, education policies, skills policies. That's a very critical
So are you
variable.
conceding the criticism that OECD policies in the past, neoliberal policies, deregulation, privatization, austerity, helped exacerbate the inequality crisis?
No, what happened what happened is, again, the crisis was created by the subprime, was created by the...
But I'm talking about inequality more broadly, which you admitted happened even before the crisis.
It destroyed millions and millions of jobs in the process.
But inequality is a long-term trend.
Yes,
I'm talking about over the last 30, 40 years.
Inequality is a long-term trend that accelerated.
Agreed. We accept acceleration. But over the course of 30 years...
what we're looking at is how do you address the question of inequality in the context of a very sluggish recovery.
But how do you also address it in the context of policies which aren't changing? Let me give you an example. A recent research paper by economists at the IMF, at the International Monetary Fund, not known for being kind of communist or socialist firebrands, they said the costs of the neoliberal agenda in terms of increased inequality are prominent, and the benefits in terms of increased growth seem fairly difficult to establish. That's a pretty damning assessment of the kind of policies that the IMF and the OECD have been advocating for decades.
We have been advocating now for some time, by the way, that we should depart from merely the fiscal consolidation, meaning more austerity, more reduction of the deficits, and expand investment, public investment in certain well-chosen, high multiplier, high impact infrastructure projects.
Do you agree that some of the policies you've believed in and advocated in the past were mistaken? They exacerbated this inequality crisis.
The question is, did you have choices?
No. That's my question. Do you accept that any of your previous views and policies?
Your question.
It's a very simple question. Do you think you got anything wrong?
But your question suggests that there were choices, After the crisis, there were no choices. You had to have.
Before the crisis, there were choices. No one forced Margaret Thatcher and Ronald Reagan to bring in privatization.
Before the crisis, the world was growing. The world was flatlining.
Inequality was growing, as you conceded.
But
inequality was also growing.
And then the crisis
gradually
advanced.
Since the 80s and 90s.
The crisis advanced the inequalities in 3 years more than it had done in the 12 years before.
But there was inequality growing beforehand in the 80s and 90s.
Yes.
I'm asking you, like the IMF researchers, do you concede that policies you supported contributed to that?
All
it's a very simple question. Yes or no?
Saying is that you have choices. And the question is, after the crisis, you did not have choices, okay? And now
You've made that point. I'm just asking if you concede you got anything wrong.
Now you have choices again.
We're running out of time. I know you have to go. Just before we finish, as a former foreign minister and finance minister of Mexico, do you think a President Trump could succeed in making Mexico pay for his proposed wall? He says he'll force Mexico to do it via trade tariffs and visa cancellations. Realistic?
I would not even like to entertain the notion that we should or should not pay for this rather crazy idea. This is hopefully not going to happen. So let's not speculate on who's going to pay for it, because it's not going to happen.
It's not going to happen because he's not going to win, or he's not going to build a wall because it's a mad idea?
It's not going to happen, period.
Okay. And as a Mexican, do you think Donald Trump's remarks about Mexican immigrants being criminals and rapists, his claim that a US judge of Mexican heritage is biased against him, do you think those are racist remarks? I had Vicente Fox on the show recently, who dominated you for the OECD job. He said he's absolutely a racist. Do you think those remarks are racist remarks about Mexico?
I think I would tend to agree with those who say that this is, not only misinformed, but yes, I think the word racist can be applied. But the other thing that is happening is that the American public has already, in the last few days, made clear what they think about this. As you saw today, I'm speaking about facts. There was a double-digit distance between the two candidates after these remarks and after these statements. I think they were particularly, unfortunate. They will have their consequences. I am the Secretary General of the OECD, and as such, I have to remain neutral, but I'm first and foremost a Mexican, and I obviously resent very much these kinds of statements. As I said, they're misguided, they're ill-informed, and I think that because the American public is wise, it will then act in consequence.
Angel Gurria, thank you very much for joining me on UpFront.
Thank you.
Sanctions, what are they good for?
A new range of hard-hitting economic sanctions.
The most comprehensive sanctions.
Unprecedented sanctions.
En même temps que des sanctions fermes.
As far back as ancient Greece, governments have tried to force change on their enemies via blockades, embargoes, and yes, economic sanctions, which have become more and more popular in recent years as an alternative to military action. But do they work? Well, in apartheid South Africa they did, and maybe in the Balkans too. But most aren't effective. Don't take my word for it. A comprehensive study by 4 academics examined 174 cases of sanctions in the 20th century and found they were successful in only 1 out of every 3 cases. I mean, think about it. The Castro brothers in Cuba are still in power 54 years after JFK embargoed them back in 1962. Vladimir Putin shows no signs of relinquishing the Crimea despite a plethora of US and EU sanctions on Russia, and despite him even admitting to the economic damage they've caused. And even in those rare cases where some say sanctions work, for example in Iraq, where Saddam Hussein was kept contained and his WMD programs we now know were destroyed, the human cost of them can be massive. Remember, the UN-led sanctions regime, described as a form of genocide by the then UN humanitarian coordinator in Iraq, has been blamed for the deaths of hundreds of thousands of Iraqi children. And yet who can forget the official US response to that horrific death toll?
We think the price is worth it.
But these days, even the US government is more honest about the downsides. A senior US Treasury official under President Obama admitted in April that sanctions are not a silver bullet, constrain diplomatic relations, dampen commercial activity, and carry a risk of retaliation. But hold on, didn't crippling sanctions force the Iranians to agree to the nuclear deal? not necessarily. One poll found 96% of Iranians said sanctions were worth it in order to retain the country's nuclear enrichment right. Meanwhile, 71% of Russians believe that Western sanctions are meant to weaken and humiliate Russia. Instead of blaming Putin for their economic woes, many Russians blame the West. Oh yes. Let's be clear, no one's saying sanctions don't work, never work, or should all be lifted at once. But given their failure rate and their human cost, isn't it time to start acknowledging the limits of sanctions? To be more judicious in their imposition, more careful in their implementation? Because make no mistake, it's not just war, sanctions can kill too. What if the government just gave every citizen a cash payment paid right into their bank account every month, regardless of whether they're rich or poor? That's the basic premise behind the universal basic income, which major political parties from Canada to the United Kingdom to Namibia are now considering adopting. In a recent referendum, however, voters in Switzerland rejected a proposal to bring in a universal basic income by a 3-to-1 margin. Joining me to debate the pros and cons of such a measure and to discuss whether it's ever likely to happen are Senator Andrea Caroni, Vice President of the Free Democratic Party in Switzerland, who campaigned against universal basic income in the referendum. He's in Bern, and here in the studio, Vox.com's Dylan Matthews, an award-winning US journalist who's been writing in favour of it for several years now. Gentlemen, thanks for joining me in the arena. Andrea Caroni, why do you think the Swiss overwhelmingly voted against a universal basic income, which has the support of economists on left and right? What was the number one argument you used to campaign against it?
This was a solution, a revolution that actually no one really needed. Switzerland has a very far-reaching welfare state. So this solution would have meant money for those who could work, but just prefer to spend the time in the swimming pool instead of working.
Dylan Matthews, why do you support a measure which gives money to people who just get to stay in their swimming pool and not get a job?
Well, I think part of the reason is that we have experimental evidence suggesting that isn't what happens. There were a number of trials of a form of basic income known as a negative income tax in the United States and Canada in the 70s. The best one of these was an experiment called Mincome in Canada, and it found that the only groups that worked less were teenagers and women who had recently had children. And so people would take time off work as a form of maternity leave or would focus more on their studies as teenagers. And I think that might seem counterintuitive, that you give people money and they don't choose to work less. But I think in practice, work gives people meaning, provides a structure for their life, provides a way to connect with their coworkers. And the role that the income was playing for people was more as a safety net.
So it's a supplement rather than a substitute?
It's a supplement rather than a substitute. And I think in most places it is set at a level that is too low for certainly for a middle-class existence and usually around the poverty line.
What's your main argument in favour? Why do you think it should be brought in? The number one reason there should be universal basic income across?
I think the main reason, and I usually argue for this in the context of the United States, is that I think it's very important to have a cash safety net that is extensive and that is universal. That we've found that programs that are means tested and programs that are in kind, that only give food or housing or one good, can sometimes fall short. In the U.S., we have a problem where many people have food stamps, but will sell food stamps if they're desperately poor for cash. This obviously depends on the country you're in, but I think in the U.S. and in Canada and in a lot of the Anglophone countries, there really is a lack of that form of safety net at the bottom end.
Andrea Caroni, what about this poverty argument? People say, the Nobel Prize winner for economics last year, Professor Angus Deaton, he supports universal basic income as a way of stemming inequality. He says we live in an age of rising inequality. The basic income is the neatest, cleanest, simplest way of ending or at least reducing poverty, is it not?
My colleague just mentioned the function as a safety net. Now, it depends on the country where you come from, how you see it. But in Switzerland, we have this safety net. We have a means-tested social security system, which gives you about as much money as the universal or unconditional income would have given you, which is about $2,500 per adult person per month. If you earn 2,500 Swiss francs a month in a hard-working job on a construction site, would you do the same if you got that money for free on the first day of the month? That was our thought. Now, I see other countries, they have more problems with inequality and with their social net, security net. I suggest they improve those systems instead of going for this radical version, which gives money to a lot of people who don't need it and who takes away the incentive to work for a lot of people who actually could work.
So one effect of that universality, however, is that it functions as a wage floor and improves the bargaining power of many workers. So you could argue that it decreases the motive to work for this construction worker. What it could also do is let that worker go to their boss and say, well, it used to be that if I did not work at all, I would have to go on welfare, I would be stigmatized, I would be sort of marginalized in my society. Now we have a system where if I don't work, I have this to fall back on. It's a universal benefit that everyone gets. It's not thought of as welfare. And I think that greatly improves their bargaining power. And in part because people are getting this money and they're spending this money and they're engaging in the economy through that way, employers will still need work. And I would suspect that if you gave this a try, and there are a number of experiments worldwide that are going to test this, you would see a bargaining up of wages for exactly that reason, because workers have another option.
I mean, it certainly increases the bargaining power. Now, but if you do the math, you'll see it can't work for society as a whole who also has to pay for it. If you take, for example, a hairdresser, maybe in Switzerland, that person, let's just say, it earns those 2,500 Swiss francs a month. Now, the same person gets that money on the first of the month without having done any work at all. Now, of course, in order to engage for a whole month of work as a hairdresser, that same person would want to have an additional 2,500 francs, which was the salary she got before. Now this person would need a total of 5,000 Swiss francs for the same job. 2,000 she got, 2,000 for the work, 2,500 for the work, which means that your haircut would be double the price. If you do this across the board for all professions, you see this increase in all salaries and all prices. So after that, you would have to increase the basic income by factor 2. And so it's a negative spiral, which can't work out because someone has to pay it.
This is the inflation argument against basic income, which has some intuitive appeal. I don't think there's a lot of evidence in contemporary society that inflation is a function of government spending as opposed to the policies of central banks. And so I think if you had a situation like that in the United States, I would expect the Fed to step in and try to put a tamp on things.
What about the general affordability argument that Andrea makes?
Absolutely.
You know, in a country like the United States, your country, the cost could run into trillions of dollars to give everyone, say, 10 grand a year, $10,000 a year. Are people who don't like higher taxes really going to buy into the argument of paying higher taxes in order for everyone to have this basic income?
It's definitely a major political struggle, and I think it's a greater struggle in the United States than a lot of countries. For one thing, we don't have a welfare state like Switzerland has, or even like the United Kingdom has. And for another thing, we have a strong stigma about receiving benefits without working that I think is less potent in other countries. But I would encourage viewers who are interested in this to look at a report that the British think tank Compass put out recently, laying out a bunch of very specific plans for a basic income. Where I agree with the senator is that I think the dollar amounts or franc amounts proposed in Switzerland were extremely high for a proposal. Compass's report puts out more modest estimates and also a plan to pay for it through adjusting income taxes. And what they find is that you can finance it with top rates of about 48-50%, which by U.S. standards is quite high, by European standards is fairly typical.
You wrote a piece for Vox headlined, "Basic income advocates lost the battle in Switzerland. They're winning the war." How so? Where are they winning the war?
So I think I've been following basic income since about 2006. The past 3 years have been just remarkable in the growth of the idea. And I think that's in large part attributable to the referendum in Switzerland, that immediately after the referendum was approved in 2013, Fox News of all places did a segment on it. The New York Times had coverage.
Where does it happen in practice? Are there places in the world where it's actually happening?
There are about four to five actual experiments that are going down now, in part because of this movement and the interest being generated by it. There's one in Oakland that a venture capital firm in the United States is doing. There's one in Utrecht in the Netherlands that the government is doing. There's one in Finland that will launch next year. There's one in Ontario, the largest province of Canada, containing Toronto. And there's one in Kenya.
So you're optimistic about the future of basic income?
I'm optimistic, and I'm very curious to see what happens. And I think these studies are better designed than some past ones. I like to think that I make decisions based on the evidence. If in 5 years these studies all come back and say that society as we know it would be destroyed, I think I'll be agreeing with the senator, but I'm curious.
We're out of time. Let me give the last word to Andrea Caroni in Bern. Andrea, Switzerland rejected the basic income. Do you think it's bad for Switzerland, or are you saying it's bad for the whole world? Would you accept that in some of these other places, in Holland, Finland, Oakland, wherever, it could be a success?
Now, those experiments, they have very different parameters than we would have had here. For example, I think the one in Oakland is targeted to a rather poor population, or sometimes they have very low amounts. The way it was proposed in Switzerland would have destroyed a lot of our social and economic tissue.
Gentlemen, we'll have to leave it there. Thanks for joining me in the arena. That's our show. Up Front will be back next week.